right, Martin, I think we're there.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, so I guess I'll just dive right in. I know we've got a pretty jam-packed schedule. I've been trying to listen into the conversations so far. But I guess I just want to say thank you for having me. I've never been officially a provocateur before, but I do like to play one at work. And I do have a formal background in strategic foresight. So I have a deep appreciation for the process you guys are going through this week. And I think, as mentioned earlier, the way it functions to challenge sort of existing mindsets that we have about a particular topic. And so kind of understanding how that process tends to unfold, I really wanted to do my best to dig up some deeper patterns about our relationship with technology, and of course now technology in the context of generative AI. Because these patterns, at least as I'm observing them, they keep repeating. They're not serving us sort of personally or societally very well. And so I want to give you some material so you can challenge them and try and break them down as you build your own scenarios. And of course, we have to do that in the real world as well, I think, if we're going to reorient the relationship that I'll be describing in a more humanity or planet-centered way. So that's my attempt. I will apologize in advance for all of the waves of bad news. It's a tough way to start, but I'll leave you on at least a few glimmers of hope, I hope. So let's just dive in, I guess. So the first one that I want to raise is how we struggle to relate to the risks of digital technology, and particularly digital technology at scale. There's just something really fundamental about the nature of digital technology that, in contrast to other analog or industrial technologies, that exploits a particular human blind spot. And when we kind of look more broadly, like, we've been very good at assessing the risk of other technologies, so collectively coordinating, building consensus around proactive policy. We've done this before in many domains, not perfectly, but reasonably well. So the question should be, why are we failing so bad this time around? And so I think it's worth looking at why we probably succeed in these other domains. And so my observation about when we do this really well is it's pretty simple. We kind of create this broad consensus when a new technology poses, pretty direct causes and effects, where the consequences are also immediate. And so we have this sort of singular experience that is broadly shared, that kind of builds that sort of social consensus we need for a good policy. And of course, that continues to build over time. We're good at this stuff. Like, this is where humans and our biology works really well. And a great example of that is the birth of commercial air travel. The Wright brothers invented flight in 1903. Commercial air travel was not far behind. It emerged on the scene around 1913, about 10 years later. But it was not accessible. There was less than 1% of the US population had ever been on a plane or traveled anywhere on a plane at that time. And in that era. And even at around the early 1920s, that number was the same. And early in that decade, around 1926, the US introduced the Air Commerce Act, and that essentially proactively set the grounds for the entire sector. Provided legislation, oversight, in pilot licensing and safety regulations. Not perfect, but it was a sweeping framework designed to improve the safety of a really nascent new sector built on a pretty incredible new innovation. And that kind of consensus really moved us forward in the right way before it was ever adopted broadly. And I think the reason's pretty obvious. Like the risks associated with air travel are direct, severe, and immediate. It is easy to imagine those consequences. We have no individual or collective failure of the imagination. Plane crash, you die. And so this is where we're good. And in this era, and this is like early DC-3, which were some of the earliest commercial airliners, but they crashed all the time, despite the regulatory framework, early ones being in place. There were 1 or 2 crashes per month in the U.S. In this phase, and so the public was also reminded. There was evidence of this direct relationship, sort of constantly brought back up, and that actually, believe it or not, when the risk is right, and there's consistent sort of issues like this, that just drove a positive feedback loop with public consensus around regulation. And I continue to think that air travel, now being the literally safest way to travel, is just one of the most amazing facts about the modern world, if you think about it. Air travel is the safest way to travel. And really that is, I think, has a lot to do with the kind of risk it represents and the frameworks that we set up as a result early on. But that is so different. So digital risk is fundamentally different. A different category of risk entirely. And it represents a type of risk where the cause and effect is very indirect. We can't see the direct link between some of the outcomes that we are now seeing and, sort of scrolling Facebook. And the impact, personally and societally, and the consequences are delayed. And so we don't have this sort of singular experience of a sort of direct risk. And so that really bifurcates the social landscape, our opinion. It undermines the consensus that we would need for policy, proactive policy around a risk that we can all sort of directly understand. And of course, our abilities just get worse as the complexity of the system goes up. And digital technologies, they operate at a sufficient complexity to make us very bad at this. But of course, the ultimate example is climate change, where our individual actions are imperceptibly linked to the impacts on the climate, and of course, the delays are measured in decades. So this really has manifest as a kind of risk blindness, not just in this other domain where we actually have become more aware of it, but with regards to digital technology. And that blind spot is huge. In fact, it's so big that social media drove a truck through it in the last couple decades. And what's interesting about that story is that social media, unlike air travel, it rocketed to mainstream adoption. Like over 50% in under 10 years. It switched from being this optional niche thing to being kind of a mandatory part of the modern world and our social landscape in that time. And in that time, we started seeing the impacts, upticks in teen depression, self-harm, suicide, sleep disorders. Of course, the political polarization and misinformation also mounted from there. And still, even with that sort of bulk of experience, no regulation. And even now, where there are research reports and dialogue just piling on itself about all of those kinds of risks, still nothing. conversation is just starting, but it's actually quite muted. And so you can see this as, in a lot of ways, a collective failure to experience that risk in a way that could, creates the consensus need for policy. The other kind of exacerbating factor there, which is different from prior non-digital technologies, is just the speed, right? So it became entangled in our culture so quickly that it kind of complicated our relationship and ability to sort of see these risks clearly. So that's an important factor as well. One of the things that I ways I like to think about this as a parent of two young kids. I think we all know that parenting culture has shifted towards a kind of a relationship with physical risk that has become kind of much more intense, with conversations about bubble wrapping our kids and snow plowing or parenting. All of those things have been kind of features of parenting culture, but literally in parallel with that overemphasis of physical risk, we have given children absolute expansive freedom in the digital world. And I think if you are a parent and you are attuned to your children's risk and you can't see any of that, I mean, that's not just on you. This is a biological blind spot. We're just not able to deal with these things. And it's a pretty devastating part of our relationship so far, and it's something we're going to have to sort out. So that's just one. The next one is a little bit more related to the economy. And so we are in process of, kind of deep in the process of transforming the most intimate pillars of what makes us human into digital products. And of course, generative AI is accelerating that. Social media would have been an early experiment. And in this whole effort, we have conveniently forgotten, or at least detached from earlier learnings with industrial technologies, that any new significant technology at scale, as it advances, it also advances the value system it sits on. And so in our case, it's free market capitalism. It's growth at all costs. But we're not engaging with how those two ideas interact very well when it comes to digital technology. And so, just as an example, it's worth taking a step back and looking at something non-digital to kind of observe how those systems have interacted around other technologies at scale. And I think a provocative and good one is factory farming, right? It's kind of a non-digital example where we can see that value system applied at scale and the kinds of effects and harms it can generate when it's operating at that level. And, it's caused a lot of harm, right? Like, if you try and take stock of where society is at as a result of, sort of industrial food production and factory farming, we're not any healthier. It's contributed to growing chronic disease, certainly devastated many local ecosystems. You can link it to climate change. And sort of sadly, my generation is probably the first one with a diminished life expectancy because of, sort of the aggregate impact on our diet. Not entirely blaming that one system, but there's lots of correlates. And not even to mention the impact on animal welfare. But, we need to connect these kinds of behaviors and outcomes that we've seen in these other systems kind of more directly to the things that are emerging in the way that we are building digital systems, because they are not operating, the digital world and what we are building is not operating on different principles. There's an underlying pattern there and value system that is the same. we just don't seem to relate to it as the same yet. And that is where the problem comes in. So in my view, this is the way it always goes. And this is the way it's going with digital technology. We create a new technical capability that opens up a new frontier, exciting. We sub in a free market value system for whatever was there before. We unbundle and productize that domain, make a huge mess doing so. The world gets more complicated while we're selling simplicity. We create a market where there was none before, and of course, all the incentives come in to centralize that power. We then are incentivized to disempower labor, devalue, quote unquote, inefficient human expertise. We ultimately erode and degrade the quality of thing we promised to improve, and just keeps on going. And we undermine the health and sustainability of the previous system, and eventually become individually, culturally disconnected from it. All the while, conveniently, that new market externalizes its complexity and unintended consequences onto other systems and people, right? It's not working in concert. So, what do you think will happen when we apply this kind of sort of tried and true market-driven process to a technology that is infinitely and instantly scalable as a platform for free market capitalism into our most intimate substance of what makes us human? Like, you got to sit with that for a little while. And you've got to sort of peel back the narratives that you may have absorbed about how it's going to be all rainbows and sunshine and productivity. It's going to follow the same pattern. But the thing you need to absorb about this sort of digital version of all of this is that there are no breaks. And we thankfully have technically just removed the final series of boundaries. So again, we have to kind of confront this. The last point I want to make here is sort of a kind of a extension of the prior two. And I want to put aside all of the existential AI will kill us dialogue for a second. Because I think people in general still today feel like we're in control. And I think on balance, we probably are. But when you sort of play out the risk, our relationship with risk, and you play out the sort of value-driven process that I just described, it seems unlikely that that perception and that feeling will hold. I may objectively not hold as well, but certainly the perception may not hold. And I guess a good way of thinking about this is that over time, we are just going to become more dependent on an ever greater number of layers of digital technology that mediate every nook and cranny of our experience of being human. That's kind of what has happened now, that those final boundaries have peeled away. And so you can just imagine yourself in the middle of a really big onion, right? There's going to be so many layers that your life is mediated through. And so, if you thought we were abstracted from each other or disconnected from each other now, or the planet or ourselves, just wait. And eventually, I think you reach a point where that dependency and the level of mediation in aggregate kind of just overwhelms our sense of human agency. And that's what is most concerning to me, because what happens when we start to realize at a cultural level that maybe we don't really have a controlling stake in ourselves anymore, right? There are just too many dependencies, and it's too hard to sort out where your agency really starts and where it ends. And this has, I think, pretty serious cultural risks. it's sort of the seeds of internal, collapse. When human value and dignity could all of a sudden sort of flip. So that's hard to think through, and I'm certainly not the only one thinking about this. This is the outcomes of a recent Gartner research report. It's from 2019, so before the generative AI explosion, which makes it even more terrifying because they were sort of seeing this a few years ago. But the research is very, very clear. As technology kind of further enables social or cognitive deskilling, strips away human agency or autonomy, or mediates it under more and more layers, the more stressed we become, the more vulnerable people become, the less humane life and particularly work will become. And ultimately that just leads, as they sort of show in this chart, as we move up and to the right, we're just going to move into deeper levels of emotional, behavioral, and functional disorders sort of rippling through society. And those are really troubling social conditions. And I'll just kind of to put a pin in it. This is a quote from that same report, which I think is quite good. And its frame was more the economy. But it stated, so our assumption that streamlining processes will lead in a linear fashion to greater efficiencies, a shift from lower level tasks to higher level tasks, and thus the magic of both cost reductions and employee satisfaction, which is what we love to tell ourselves, that may be fundamentally flawed. And I think that is still true today. You only need to replace that with generative AI. And so, our relationship is a little bit toxic, maybe a lot abusive. We don't really feel collectively that it's something we can exit, but we will need to. And so, to end that, those waves of despair with a little bit of hope, these are at least a few directions worth exploring in your scenarios. And so, I would encourage you to take those patterns as serious ones that need to be reshaped somehow, and not to paper over them, but to deal directly with them. And I think you could go at them in at least these three ways, and certainly many more. But we can think of better ways to learn from our mistakes, our recent mistakes with digital technology, because we clearly have lessons to relearn. We can lower the barriers for that kind of dialogue or ethical inquiry at work or in society. I think we can do, especially with the technology we have, a much better job of modeling indirect or unintended consequences of these systems at scale. We need to replace our imagination, our failure of imagination, with something. We need new tools that sort of scaffold that blind spot. We can also build more of what we want and what we value into the things we're building. We are not perfect. We can build systems that sort of bias values or objectives that we need or may need to, in fact, survive. And I think if we can build, or I think we will actually need to build new systems of democratic dialogue that actually scale. So technology is moving so fast. We need new platforms where we can arrive at that kind of consensus locally, nationally, or globally, that could provide the foundation for regulation. Because again, without that kind of scaffolding, I just don't see how we get to good regulation. And sort of the underlying challenge there is consensus, and shared visions and ideas about the risk. And we need to bet on ourselves, right? So we get very caught up in the novelty and power of digital technologies, but we need to be very, very clear about how they distribute and can distribute power between labor and capital, and bias labor, because that's not the bias in the system. And we also need to think about how the real world will counterbalance the digital one we're building, and how we might be able to sort of create more of what we want in in our physical environment. So maybe a few directions you guys can think about, but certainly I wouldn't limit you to that. I think I went a few minutes over. I apologize, but that's all I've got. Thanks.